the country. The New Yorker reports in 2017 that case farm chicken plants are among the most dangerous workplaces in America, having been cited for over 240 labor rights violations in the past 7 years. Osiel Lopez Perez, an immigrant worker in the meat plant, lost his leg after being forced to stand on top of machines to sanitize them despite their objections they could get hurt. And when those immigrant workers have fought for higher pay or better conditions, those companies have used their immigration status to get rid of those workers, avoid for paying injuries, and silence their dissent. It's the silencing that is so critical in today's debate. Representative Pang worries about our agricultural workers, but fails to acknowledge that today's bill slowly phases out those subsidies rather than simply pulling the rug out from under the industry, as her and Representative Nagarjuna claim, meaning jobs wouldn't decrease as suddenly as they claim. But more importantly, when those companies prevent workers from reporting the abuse I talked about, this Congress and our constituents will never know how extensive those human rights abuses were. But we do know that in the affirmation, we stopped them completely. We directly cut subsidies and financial incentives to the corporations that have long been abusing our hardworking immigrant constituents for far too long. Affirm. Second, you affirm because this legislation helps low-income minority Americans recover from environmental racism. Representative Smith discussed the environment. I'd like to analyze it from another point of view. The New York Times reports in 2020 that the meat business had been attracting growing scrutiny for its climate change consequences in recent years, because beef production creates roughly 4 to 8 times the emissions from pork, chicken, or egg production per gram of protein, and all have a larger climate change footprint than plant-based proteins like soy or beans. As a result, scientists and environmentalists are encouraging Americans to eat less meat. And that is critical, as Princeton University shows in 2020 that environmental racism is the unequal access to a clean environment and basic environmental resources based on race. Representative Tyler, Representative Nargujana, low-income communities of color are disproportionately victimized by environmental hazards and are far more likely to live in areas with heavy pollution. People of color are more likely to die of environmental causes, and more than half of the people who live close to hazardous waste are people of color. This clearly subjects these communities to inequitable living conditions. So Negation comes up here and talks about how low-income people can't get the protein and dairy they need. Realize that low-income people are actually inherently worse off in the negation world. They inhale the pollutants from these industries and are more likely to die as a result. So yes, Representative Nagarjuna, it is a matter of equity, and that is why you affirm.
Thank you for that speech of exactly 3 minutes. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise at this time. That'll go to Representative N.
So meat and dairy production is bad for the environment, right?
Yes.
And that disproportionately affects low income and people of color.
Yes.
But when you pass today, it increases meat and dairy prices, but middle to high class people are still going to keep buying it, right?
Of course, but the point is there's going to be less purchasing of those products.
Yeah, right? But it's still the majority of people are going to keep buying the same products. So you're just letting rich people disproportionately affect the poor people.
You're ignoring both effects, right? We're decreasing the effect in the environment.
Not by a lot.
While also incentivizing poorer people to go.
Because the majority of this country is going to keep on going out there and buying meat, and that's just going to hurt.
Rodriguez.
So if we cut the amount of money going to these factories that are abusing workers, why wouldn't that just push them to like cut down on safety regulations even more?
Right. So basically what would happen likely is they would cut the jobs first, right? And the negation has claimed that. But the thing with that is, since we're slowly phasing out the industry rather than simply just pulling the rug out from under, there's going to be an expansion in healthier food industries.
I get this idea, like these factories, like we should enforce strong regulations, but like unemploying these workers, is that really the best option?
So Representative, like I said, since we're phasing it out, we're going to allow the proliferation of new.
But they'll eventually lose their jobs, right?
That questioning block has elapsed. Speaker may be virtually seated. We're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Guan.
I thank the chair. Again, for the reference of the chamber, I'm Representative Guan, that's spelled G-U-A, and I'm from the California Coast District, and I'm speaking for the first time in this session on the negation of this bill. Can I please get a thumbs up or nod from all the judges, P on parliamentarian, whenever you're ready? And I'll assume that Judge Reed is ready unless I get a verbal indication. Wonderful, thank you. There's no doubt that this Congress has to ensure that agriculture in our nation goes to the right place. However, it's specifically because this bill continues to fund a flawed system that I must negate. First, recognize that in the status quo, crop subsidies go to the wrong places. According to the USDA in May of 2016, half of all subsidies went to farmers with household incomes over $150,000. That means billions of dollars every year go to households with nearly income of 3 times higher than a median US household income, which was little over $55,000 that year. Commodity payments in 2016 were just over $5 billion. Half of that went to 150,000 plus households. The problem with subsidized crops insurance is that it allows farmers to operate in ways that increase the risk of crop and other forms of financial loss because they know that any losses they incur will be covered by taxpayers. Farmers have responded by planting crops on poor quality land, cutting back on things like pesticides and fertilizers that reduce the risk of crop losses, and reducing the extent to which they diversify their enterprises. The Congressional Budget Office explains that agricultural producers, as a group, obtain a sizable benefit from the program. Considered together, producers received about $65 billion more claim payments than they paid in premiums between 2000 and 2016. Today, agricultural subsidies and insurance cost the US taxpayers about $20 billion annually. I completely agree with Representative Smith and Carbaskian that we need to turn to more renewable sources of energy and food, but not by using a system that is so flawed in the status quo. This bill doesn't provide any remedy for the issues regarding subsidies in the status quo, so we must fail. Next, let's look at how we need subsidies right now. The Farm Credit Administration explains in October of 2017 that agriculture accounts for nearly 10% of American imports. This is one of the few sectors of the US economy that runs a trade surplus, helping to reduce the size of the country's overall trade deficit. American agriculture depends heavily on foreign markets. The report further states that more than a third of American farm revenue comes from exports. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN explains that agricultural commodities are subject to great swings in price due to weather conditions and market volatility. Without government support to smooth the impact of market fluctuations, huge numbers of American farmers will be pushed to bankruptcy, forced off the land, and into dependence on welfare. This would have knock-on effects on the whole economy of America and would also devastate the social structure of rural America. Without government support to smooth out fluctuation, consumers, as Representative Najruna stated, would sometimes be faced with price spikes when harvests were poor. As family income is relatively fixed, price spikes for basic foods like bread, meat, beans, and dairy could severely affect the standard of living enjoyed by many Americans today. Even if such high prices only occurred occasionally, their possibility would create general uncertainty about future levels of disposable income in America. This could be very damaging to consumer confidence and to the entire economy as well. Recognize that although the affirmation's impacts are strong, understand that rural Americans are hurt the most from this. Recognize that although the affirmation's claims are strong, none of them actually materialize. Recognize that today, we must fail to protect our constituents.
Thank you for that speech of 2 minutes and 54 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. It's going to go to Representative Smith.
Thank you, Chair. So in your second point, I believe you brought up that 2017 card talking about American agriculture and how it's fragile but important for exports. Yes. During my speech and actually in our questioning period, I was talking about that 2021 card that is saying that agriculture has had the 4th best year in the past 5 decades in the US with revenue 45% up since 2019. Yes. How can you use this 2017 card to combat that?
Excuse me. So that's because, as I stated in my speech, right now, when we don't have these subsidies, there are like price spikes because the
right now we have so many subsidies from the trade war, from the pandemic. They're all in place to help the meat and dairy industry.
Because right now, like I said, there's like natural disasters, some things you can't predict. So
next question block, Representative Hassanali.
Hi, Representative. Are you familiar with CSA farms or community-supported agriculture?
A bit, but I'm sure you could elaborate.
Yeah, so they're small farms that are typically fruit and vegetable growing. Today's legislation diverts subsidies from meat to fruits and vegetables. Do you understand that we achieve your impacts of smaller farms getting helped with an affirmative ballot?
Yeah, but there's also another point, right? The fact that, as I mentioned in the previous questioning block, agriculture is a very volatile industry. You never know what's going to happen when you're harvest, right? So without our subsidies,
I understand that, but Representative Smith just proved
has elapsed. Speaker may be virtually seated. We're now in line for speech in the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise up this time. That'll go to Representative Lynn.
I thank the chair. That's Representative Lynn, just spelled L-I-N. I know a few of my judges are always ready, but once the rest are, I'll be good to go. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you. It's probably the most typical politician stance to continue to stand up for dairy and meat industries that profit off of billions of dollars worth of taxpayer money, label them as victims within the agricultural system, and then refuse to give that very same help to local farmers that are trying to improve the health of America. Understand that today's legislation doesn't do anything except for increase accessibility for all Americans. First, because this bill doesn't hurt low-income Americans. There is one idea that the arguments towards low-income Americans spouted by Representative Nagarjuna and Guan are contingent on: dairy and meat companies not being able to survive the loss in subsidies. But that's just not true. The Northeastern University Political Review in July of 2019 explains that Representative Guan is partially right. These industries in the status quo do heavily rely on government funding, but it's not because they can't make enough profit themselves. It's because they made such an excess that they rely on our federal government to bail them out each time. American farmers dump millions of gallons of excess milk a year. In 2016, for example, the American dairy industry drained 43 million gallons of excess milk in fields, and the beef industry dumped 5 million tons of unwanted and uneaten meat. Why did they do that? Because that year, and every single year before that as well, the federal government bought all of that excess food, put it in trash cans, and let it go to waste. These corporations, on the other hand, still profited off of these abusive and wasteful practices. But here's why this legislation finally turns the table for low-income Americans. The Foundation for Economics Education in 2016 explains that high meat subsidies and virtually none for fresh produce means fruits and vegetables, especially in food deserts and rural communities, can't compete for consumers. As a result, the health of Americans in rural and low-income neighborhoods continues to go down because they can't afford fresh produce, and the only thing available is highly processed meats and other junk food that's purposefully spread by the subsidies that we have in the status quo. But second, we also step towards addressing global poverty overall, because the impact of meat consumption isn't limited to America's borders. We've forced American companies virtually everywhere. Take, for instance, the findings of a report by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN in February of 2020. Because of our agricultural subsidies in economically advanced countries like the US, we artificially depress international market prices, so much so that we induce poorer nations to import food that local farmers could otherwise produce more effectively, because they've been forcibly made cheaper by the US government in comparison. As a result, local farmers are outcompeted entirely. These farmers are forced to exit the market because they can't afford to grow local crops, and in comparison to American international companies, much less put food on the table for their new families. Columbia's Journal of International Affairs in February of 2020 explains that eliminating these agricultural subsidies by itself in the US alone would lift 6 million people out of poverty around the world. You help the poor not only in America, but across the globe when you pass legislations like these.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 7 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative Chandru.
Hi, Representative. Fantastic speech, but I have a question. Right now, certain schools rely on subsidies for milk, subsidies for dairy to afford milk for their, for kids, right?
Those subsidies go to the schools, not to the dairy industry.
Right, it goes to the school so they can afford money to buy milk. Now, if the cost of that actually goes up, how are they going to afford enough nutrients for the kids that go to the school?
First of all, I'm saying that those are different subsidies, but even if we were operating under your frame of reference, okay. I already told you why dairy companies can still survive. They've just been producing excess because they know the federal government will build.
Hold on a second. And when you stop subsidizing,
Hi, Representatives. So this bill simply says that we're funding the agricultural industry as a whole, correct?
We're taking away from meat and dairy and funding fruit and vegetables, yeah.
Right, absolutely. Does it specify what kind of farms we'd be funding?
Not necessarily, but in this status quo, most of our meat and dairy industry subsidies are going towards large corporations. So even worst case scenario would be no shift.
Right, absolutely. So in the fruit and dairy industry, do we have a problem of monoculture farms?
I mean, probably, yeah, but I also don't think that's
Does this harm the climate and low-income Americans?
Regardless, they're going to continue doing that anyways. I'd rather have fruits and vegetables available to people.
Thank you.
Thank you. That questioning block has elapsed. Representative Carbassian, that is approved. However, I just ask that you don't put that in the chat while someone's speaking because it pops up and it could disturb the speaker. Okay, so, we're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. That'll go to Representative Pang.
Thank you. Can everyone see and hear me okay? Great. This is Representative Pang, spelled P-A-N-G, speaking for the first time in this session. P.O., I have you pinned, so if you could just let me know when everyone's ready.
Looks like everyone's ready.
Great. A recent study found that a flood in Iowa damaged 20 million acres of farmland. And honestly, now it seems like this Congress has taken inspiration as we consistently flood our farms with money, not caring about the damage it causes. Fail this legislation to dry up this problem at the source. You stand with me in the negation for the sole reason that it moves meat production overseas. Representatives Smith, Kabassian, and Lynn do a great job explaining the effects, the positive and combating the negative effects in the United States. The issue is that not a single debater in this whole round has talked about the effects internationally. Let me fix that for you. As the Columbia University Journal of International Affairs finds in February of last year, there's a total of $38 billion every single year spent on meat and dairy subsidies, meaning that the sheer volume of that funding props up American farmers and ranchers, and more importantly, keeps them in the States. That's why cutting meat subsidies is so unique from any other industry, because they're so dependent on our funds. Here's what happens when we take away those subsidies. As the World Health Organization explains in January of 2017, the majority of tobacco production used to be in the United States. But as we slowly phase out subsidies, the same thing that this legislation does, all of those companies began to move overseas. And now, 40% of the world's tobacco production is in China. When we remove their subsidies, the sole reason they stay in the States, we leave them no other option but to move overseas. There's two main impacts with that. First is that it fuels the flames in the Amazon. As the Georgia Center for Earth and Chemistry Research finds in December of last year, the Brazilian beef exports is the largest beef exporter in the whole world, totaling $5.4 billion. But as the Brazilian Beef Exporters Association itself confesses to us, in order to expand their industry, they single-handedly took over 80% of Amazon deforestation. When Representatives Carbassian and Smith tell you that we're fighting climate change with this legislation, you're not solving the issue, you're simply spreading it to other countries that can't handle it. But the second country that takes the hit is China when you provoke more pandemics. As Dr. Michael Greger finds, zoonotic diseases like COVID are not anything new. And as the World Health Organization continues in September of last year, the most likely source of the next pandemic would be the swine flu. And Chinese factory farms are famous for their poor standards. Representative Carbassian tells you about the low labor standards within our own farms, but it's significantly worse in China. If you're actually worried about health, Representative Smith, then you stand on the negation. If we pass, you essentially leave our people to drown. Don't leave them in the floods. Give them the help that they need.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative Mazumdar.
Can you tell me what percent of meat we import?
I'm not sure. I don't have the statistic for you, but I don't see why it's relevant.
It's near 80%. So if we're already importing almost all of our meat, then how is this legislation making any big difference?
Right. I'm not worried about the effect that happens when we import meat to the United States, but rather the effects internationally, right? When the companies in the US start moving outside of the United States, that worsens all of the impacts that I told you about.
Why will they move outside if Representative Lynn already told you?
Hi, so you argue that companies are going to lose profit without subsidies, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are they supposed to pick up their farms from Georgia and go to the Amazon if they're not surviving well?
Right. The moment that they hear that we're cutting their subsidies, they're already very profitable now. That's what the whole affirmation is arguing.
But
with the profit they already have, they can move.
Farming is highly dependent on the infrastructure and the land that you buy. Can many American companies afford that?
Yes, we can, because we're already subsidizing them.
That questioning block has elapsed. Speaker may be seated. We're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Rodriguez.
Thank the chair. For the first time in this session, that's Christian Rodriguez. Whenever you're ready. Okay, presiding officer. Awesome, I'll get started. It's really no secret that lobbying in this country is a prevalent problem, and the meat industry is a perfect example of that, where 4 companies control almost the entire market, and yet time and time again, we bail them out at the expense of those who actually need help. So I ask all of you, please, for once put into front of your mind low-income Americans who quite frankly suffer every single day as a result of our inaction, and pass this legislation. So the negative did a very interesting thing where they started to talk about monopolization in the agricultural sector, specifically with fruits and vegetables. And I'm talking specifically with Representative Guan on the negation, who talked about how we're simply going to give these fruit and vegetable subsidies to big farmers that are going to only take away all of it from low-income farmers. That's like calling the tea kettle black, because that's what's happening with the meat industry. Because the American Prospect explains on May 4th of 2020, the biggest 4 meat companies control 70% of the entire market. What does that mean in the context of this round? Every single person on the negation, from Representatives Guan to Representative Nagaraja to all the way to Representative Pang, all of their impact about hurting low-income people who simply can't protect themselves completely ignores the reality that the meat industry quite literally profits off of the suffering of low-income Americans. Claire Kellaway from Vox News elaborates on February 24th of 2021, explaining that because the meat industry is so monopolized, they, among other things, 1, drive low-income farmers out of business, 2, ignore safety regulations to pollute drinking water, and 3, artificially raise prices because no one would be able to compete with them. Representative N, it's quite ironic you talk about how meat prices will increase when quite literally the big meat monopolies are already doing that. If you truly are going to advocate for people who can't afford food, who can't go out to the grocery store and get dinner for their families, affirming is the only way you can step up to these industries. But then Representative Pang will tell you that, no, these companies are simply going to outsource and the entire world is going to be set on fire as a result. 2 reasons why that's incorrect. First, Representative Link correctly pointed out in cross-examination, it's quite expensive to actually move across the world, especially when you're literally losing money from the US government after you pass. Second, she then gives the example of tobacco. But the difference between tobacco and meat is that we started taxing tobacco, whereas with today's legislation, we're simply cutting subsidies. It's not a one-to-one comparison. So besides the fact that you stand up to a meat industry that is keeping down low-income Americans, what is the benefit of passing? You fund an agricultural sector that will quite literally save lives. Because a study by Jose Penalvo from Tufts University on June 6th of 2017 found every 10% increase in fruit and vegetable subsidies reduces preventable deaths from cardiovascular diseases by 160,000 people. I'm asking all of you, give low-income Americans the actual chance to afford food that will save them, and affirm.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative N.
Okay, sure. So like in the status quo, like meat and dairy industries, they're like exploiting their monopolizations to raise prices for low-income people. Can't they just do that even more when they have to like increase their production cost as well?
So what I'm saying is that like this idea that like we shouldn't pass because the meat industry is going to raise prices, like it's happening in either world. The difference is when you pass, the fruit and vegetable industry can now lower prices.
No, but it's not equatable like either world. One is a lot worse than the other to the point where low-income people can't afford it.
Low-income people can't afford fruits and vegetables right now. That changes after you pass.
Thank you. Let's talk about the tobacco example that I provided. You said that it's really hard to do offshoring, right? So if there's subsidies and we tax them, which is even worse, like you said, then how are they able to do it?
We're not taxing the meat industry.
I know. I'm saying you said that the reason why tobacco moved is because we taxed them on top of that. And then you also said that the meat and dairy industries won't be able to because they won't have enough money under this legislation. So if tobacco could, then why can't the industry?
The problem is you're contradicting yourself. You need money to move to another country and open up
You're right.
business. But you don't have the money to do that.
Questioning clock as the last speaker and questioner may be seated. We're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Tyler.
I thank the chair. For the judges, that is Tyler, spelled Tyler, and this is my first time speaking this legislative session. If I could get some sort of quick indication that you're ready to go, that would be awesome. Awesome. Representatives, trust me. As a vegetarian of 2.5 years who's done my fair share of arguing about the need to cut the meat and dairy industry, I still have to stand on the negation because this bill simply doesn't solve the problem. This debate has come down to 2 key impacts. First, the impacts on low-income Americans, and second, the climate impacts. So let's break them down. Let's start with the first facet of the impact on low-income Americans that Representative Smith champions. Health is severely hurt by red meat. Now, let's take a look at the fact that this, while does disincentivize buying, it fundamentally hurts low-income Americans. We've heard this a lot, but let's break it down. Representative Narjuna already told us how important milk access is, but it directly impacts our schools as well, contrary to Representative Lynn's claims. The National School Lunch Program in 2016 tells us the National School Lunch Program serves nutritional food to 30 million children every single year. This program is definitely necessary, but also needs to operate at a low cost to function. These lunches include milk for children as it's nutritious for a young age. Dairy subsidies thereby keep these lunch costs low. Then the special milk program, published in 2011, tells us further that special milk programs also exist designated specifically to feed young school children who otherwise do not have access to food. Without these dairy subsidies, the cost of these special milk programs increase, limiting the scope and range of children that can benefit and receive nutritious value. Then let's take a look at this idea of raising prices. Let's take a look at the research paper with the Climate Risk Management Journal in 2017, which is specifically looking to climate risks that tells us that the meat industry provides too much sustainability. It provides sustainability and the ability to provide food. Livestock contributes greatly to food security, quote, because they're suppliers of global calories, proteins, and essential micronutrients. They're produced in areas that have difficulty growing crops, and most of the feed for livestock is not appropriate for human consumption. And they provide manure for crop production. What we can see is by phasing out this industry, it has a multilateral impact across multiple different industries and harms food security across the board. But then we can also see that Julian Bagani, The Guardian, of May 29th of 2019, refutes this idea that it wouldn't harm them, that the systemic failure of our food system is that we've become addicted to food that is cheap, meaning that when we stop meat subsidies, and while yes, we are funding these fruits and vegetables, it will only continue to lead them to more processed foods. But then let's take a look at what Representative Quram brought up, that the shift in subsidies only hurts more of the market. Now, Representative Carbassian tells us that this will benefit immigrant workers, but the New York Times on April 4th of 2020 tells us that about half of all crop hands in the United States, more than 1 million, are undocumented immigrants. And the agricultural industry focuses on seasonal labor that doesn't protect these immigrants. By continuing to fund this monocrop system that only continues to harm the environment even more and harm these immigrants, we are harming the low-income immigrants across the scale. We see first that it impacts food security across the level, and that is unnegotiable. And second, it continues to harm an industry that is equally problematic. The affirmative has a burden to prove that there's benefit, and because we are fundamentally changing a system that is so broken, and this is simply a band-aid, it means that we must negate, because it only perpetuates abuses.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 12 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Carbassian.
Representative, how do you change the status quo in any way for those workers when you negate?
You don't change the status quo. The burden is that we see that this only turns to an industry that is already broken on monocrop. We also have seen multiple times that the agricultural industry hurts the environment just as much.
So, but Representative, so fruit and vegetable subsidies, though encouraging those would not hurt the environment in any way near as much, correct?
I actually appreciate that you asked this. It absolutely would, because monocrop culture is continually perpetuated throughout this industry, and they waste billions of gallons of water and continue to harm.
Likely come along with incentives for sustainable agriculture.
Representative Rodriguez.
So don't get me wrong, I fully agree that like monocropping and like raising meat can both be destructive to the environment, but like, does it waste more water than meat?
We do know that if we continue to subsidize it, where you're saying it will only increase this, it will go to these corporations that do have unethical practices, which means that we are only continuing to perpetuate the system and brush it under the rug.
But didn't Representative Smith in her sponsorship prove that the meat industry wastes a lot more water than the agricultural industry?
Currently it does because it's not subsidized as much.
No, it's like proportional, isn't it?
So the meat industry will be decreasing.
That questioning block has elapsed. Speaker may be virtually seated. We're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. That'll go to Representative Hassan Ali.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Representative Hassan Ali. This will be my first time speaking in today's legislative session on the affirmation. If anybody's not ready, feel free to let me know. I'll give you a couple seconds. All right, I don't hear anything, so I'll get started. Yesterday was just another ordinary day. I went to a congressional hearing, read some briefings, and almost 8,000 people died from being overweight or obese. Yes, yesterday was just another ordinary day, but let's ensure that that is not the normal that this legislative body stands for. Let's affirm. By diverting subsidies and funding from meat and dairy to fruits and vegetables, we make them more accessible and readily available. That provides solvency to the very problem Representative Smith posed at the start of today's debate. Now, Representative Guan was incredibly concerned that small meat and dairy farms who truly need government assistance are not getting it. Let me explain why you achieve his contention with an affirmative ballot, because he wasn't able to tell you in questioning, and no affirmative speaker has told us either. The balance quantifies by telling us the top 10% of farms received more than 78% of the $200 billion doled out. Unfortunately, that distribution has led to more than 62% of US farms not receiving any subsidies. So if you're an average person living in rural America, these subsidies aren't going to your local farmer down the road. They're going to big agribusinesses. Representative Guan, by passing today's bill for reform in the system, we pave the way for these small CSAs to get the help you need. Now, in questioning, Representative Nagarjuna repeatedly brings up low-income residents, but he wasn't able to answer Representative Lin's question about food deserts. This bill provides solvency because lower prices because of the subsidization of the fruit and vegetable industry makes these healthier options cheaper and more readily available. Representative Pang also told you that these corporations were going to move to other countries, otherwise known as capitalist flight. But Representative, if you're going to talk about flight, you also have to talk about landing. The subsidization of the meat industry has caused the price of meat to drop significantly in the past 2 decades. And according to recent data from Metronomics, the American government spends 0.04% of meat subsidies on fruits and vegetables. When the price of something is lower, people consume more of it. But you don't need these statistics to tell you these impacts. Representative Nagarjuna admitted those impacts to me in questioning. That is one of the largest reasons why meat and other dairy products become such a large share of American consumption. And that could not be coming at a worse time. The CDC tells us that the US obesity prevalence rate has reached almost 42%, the highest it's ever been. Representative Nagarjuna, nobody is telling these Americans to only eat fruits and vegetables. We're making it easier for low-income constituents to get access to them. Representatives, there is no vote but a vote on the affirmation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 4 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of questioning. All questioners, please rise up this time. That's going to go to Representative Guan.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Representative. That was a great speech. So
Thank
do you
you.
think that without subsidies, like these industries can be self-sustaining?
What do you mean?
So do you think like the meat and dairy industry is self-sustainable without our help, without subsidies?
Yeah, absolutely. Representative Smith proved that these farms are doing better than they ever have. If we take away subsidies and divert
farms
them to
they
fruits
can
and
be doing better than they ever have right now, but it only takes one maybe bad harvest to change all that, right?
Yeah, but by diverting it to fruits and vegetables, we lower the cost of those and make it more easily accessible to low-income residents.
Representative Smith.
Thank you,
Hi.
Chair. So according to the USDA, are corn, wheat, rice, and soy, are they classified as grains or fruit and vegetables?
I'm not sure. Could you tell me?
Okay, so those are actually all classified as grains or food crop. If we were to pass this legislation, are we specifically putting subsidies in for fruit and vegetables or feed crop grains?
We're specifically putting them in for fruits and vegetables.
So that's going to be helping potatoes, tomatoes, onions, carrots, broccoli, bell peppers, lettuce, those types of things that are produced, not the large monocrops as spoken about by Representative Tyler, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
Thank you so much.
You. That questioning block has the last speaker may be seated. We're now
I thank the chair.
The chair thanks you. We're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Chandru unopposed.
I thank the chair. Hi, everyone. This is Representative Chundru again for the third time today, first time in this session. When all of the judges could give me a thumbs up or any indication if they're just not ready, I'll gladly begin. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. If you presented this bill to Gordon Ramsay in his kitchen, he'd tell you that this lamb, or in this case, Bill, is so undercooked, it's following Mary to school. Sadly, because this bill is undercooked and dangerous for our constituents, we are forced to take a page out of Gordon Ramsay's book and fail this legislation. Now, Representative Smith, I'll concede, removing meat subsidies is actually fine, but not removing milk subsidies. That's the problem with this legislation, and that's why you're forced to fail. First, fail this legislation because it raises the price of milk too much for low-income constituents to afford. This is because when we remove subsidies on milk with Section 1, the prices will obviously increase. So Representative Tyler told you about the special milk program. Let me quantify her points and show you the impacts. This program makes it so that low-income children who can't afford to pay for their lunch like we can get the nutrition they need. But Representative Lynn said that there's no difference in prices. Let's see how that's absolutely false. The Columbia Center on International Affairs on February 11th of 2020 tells us that without milk subsidies, the prices of milk can raise by over $2. In some states, that's almost a 200% increase in costs. But these special milk programs exist specifically to feed young children in schools who otherwise don't have access to nutrients, such as the ones in milk. However, Representative Lynn argues that it does not affect schools, but without these dairy subsidies, the cost of these special milk programs increases, limiting the range of children who can receive the nutritional value by almost half. In my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, where the Census Bureau reports there's a 33% poverty rate, it is imperative that I give them the opportunity to get the nutrition that they need to properly grow up. Because unlike everyone in this room, my constituents often have to worry about where their next meal will come from. Don't punish the children for the actions of the meat industry. Representative Smith, Representative Lynn, Representative Rodriguez, reconsider your position for them. But Representative Hassan Ali, you're talking about how veggies might be cheaper, but there is no program in place to provide those for children in school. But on top of this, they need the nutritional value of milk. But Representative Carbassian tells you that there's going to be better working conditions after we pass this legislation. There's going to be unemployment. That's for sure proven by the negation, but he has no link to talk about how there's going to be better working conditions. His impact falls. But next, fail this legislation because it bankrupts livestock farmers because it forces them to pay for contaminated milk. Representative Lynn, let's take a look at why milk is being dumped. The CDC reports of September 15th of 2017 that certain types of infections often are found in milk but are undetectable by farmers, so they often have to then dump it. However, they can't afford the costs of the dumping, and it makes it so that the subsidies are the only way they can save them from being bankrupt. For my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, where farmers make up a large portion of my community, I failed this legislation for them. Don't present an undercooked, unadvisable bill to our constituents, and don't take away essential nutrients from our children and bankrupt our essential farmers. Take a page out of Gordon Ramsay's book and fail this legislation for them.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative Hassan Ali.
Hi, Representative.
Hi, Representative. So the National School Lunch Program that's currently in place that serves thousands of schools, what are some of the other requirements of it besides that dairy component?
Right, like I told you, this isn't the National School Lunch Program. This is the Special Milk Program. It's a completely different program that provides milk to almost 3,500 schools.
Okay, but fundamentally, this National School Lunch Program
Right.
also requires the need for fruits and vegetables.
Okay.
What is a negative ballot due to programs like that?
Representative, when you're increasing the cost of milk by over 200%, you're ensuring that these children can't get that nutritional value because only half of them will be able to get it under the Special Milk Program.
Representative Mazumdar.
Do federal school food funding programs pay schools a flat fee every year?
So Representative, we wouldn't actually have a need for the Special Milk Program if all the schools could afford buying milk for their for the kids.
All right. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that they give schools waivers, which means it doesn't matter what the cost.
Representative, we wouldn't need such a program if all of these schools could afford the milk in the first place.
Right, but the waivers that they provide give them the extra difference for them to afford the milk. What's the problem with that difference?
The reason that we have the Special Milk Program is because that's not in place.
Thank you. That questioning block has elapsed. Speaker may be seated. We're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. That goes to Representative Mazumdar.
Thanks. That's Mr. Mazumdar. First time this session, Mazumdar. Thumbs up for my judges and I'll be on my way. All right. A recent survey found that McDonald's iconic golden arches are recognized by more people than the Christian cross. But as the gospel of American fast food spreads across the world, it's important to recognize what we sacrifice as a people along the way. It's because the satisfaction of consumers is only made possible by the suffering of workers that we have to affirm. Representative Lin already explained why this legislation will not harm the meat and dairy industries. But I'd like to be the first speaker on the affirmation to hold the negation to their highest ground. Let's assume this bill will decimate the meat and dairy industries. Even then, we should affirm. Representative Nagarjuna and Chundru both say that this bill will raise the price of meat and dairy products. They say that low-income Americans will just stop eating this food and eventually starve. But in reality, they'll just transfer to healthier alternatives. According to the Northeastern Political Review in May of last year, meat and dairy products are extremely price elastic. That means when the prices of milk, cheese, and butter rise, people buy less of it. Not only that, they shift to healthier, plant-based alternative products like soy, rice, and coconut, which produce the same nutritional benefits and more, Representative Chundru. So in the short term, Representative Nagarjuna, low-income Americans will barely feel the difference in rising costs since the subsidies are actually phased out over 10 years. But in the long term, they'll switch to healthier alternatives, which are actually made cheaper through the subsidies in Section 1, as Representative Hassan Ali just said. And that's a great thing because we make working conditions better by harming the meat and dairy companies. According to NPR in August of 2016, most employees in the meat and dairy industries are undocumented immigrants working 12-hour shifts in dangerous jobs. Between 2015 to 2018, a worker in the meat industry lost a body part or was sent to the hospital every other day because they were struggling to meet the artificial demand which legislation in the past that this Congress has passed has actually facilitated. This is the industry which the negation protects. Representative Chundru, you say we should fail this bill and help agricultural workers. I say we should affirm this bill and punish the industry which treats them no better than the cattle they are forced to slaughter. Representative Guan and Tyler, you say that subsidies are awful, but this isn't a reason to fail the bill because in either world, we're either subsidizing meat or we're subsidizing vegetables. Choose the side that offers you better working conditions and a smaller carbon footprint. That leaves Senator Pang, who says that meat companies will pick up and go to Brazil. I'd argue that the cost of moving their entire production to a different country is worth more than losing subsidies they don't even really need. And even if I'm wrong, your concern is entirely hypothetical. What's not hypothetical is the direct improvement in working conditions and health standards which the affirmation provides you. McDonald's golden arches span 6 continents, but the shadow they cast here at home allows for exploitation to go unseen. Pass today's legislation and set a gold standard for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That'll go to Representative Chandru.
I thank the chair. So Representative Mazumdar, I said we failed this legislation because it's taking a sledgehammer through a problem that needs the nuance of a scalpel, but I'll take you at your highest ground. What other sources are children going to get calcium and protein from? Go ahead and tell me.
The first thing I'll say is that the prices of milk are not going to rise in the way you say they will, because it's actually going to happen. It's going to, let me answer your question.
Okay.
It's going to happen over 10 years, which allows for this Congress to give more money to
but 10% subsidies off the time, at least minimize the scope.
In the long run, we switch our children to better alternatives.
Don't they minimize the scope of what these programs can like give children?
Tyler.
Hi, Representative. Since we've shown that the veggie and fruit industries have just as bad working conditions, how is this an improvement at all?
Okay, if both have the same level of working conditions, which I highly doubt because the meat and dairy industry kills a person every other day, I would still prefer the system which has a smaller carbon footprint. Cows account for 15% of global emissions, broccoli doesn't. So I, at the very least, want to support the system that has a smaller carbon footprint, and that gives you on the affirmation.
Because we see that they'd be turning towards monocrops as well, doesn't this also mean we have this?
Again, our subsidies decide what they actually produce.
That questioning block has elapsed. Speaker may be seated. Seeing as everyone has spoken on this piece of legislation, I'm going to unilaterally move to previous question. So we will begin voting on meat subsidies. Everyone who wishes to pass this piece of legislation, raise your placard at this time. And when I call your name, you can put your placard down. Representative Carbassian, Representative Mazumdar, Representative Lin, Representative Hassanali, Representative Smith, and Representative Rodriguez. I count 6. Everyone wishing to vote on the negation of this piece of legislation, please raise your placard at this time and put it down when I call on you. Representative N, Representative Guan, Representative Chandru, Representative Tyler, Representative Pang. There should be 1 abstention. All who wish to abstain. Oh, wait, no, me. Okay, so on a vote of 6-5, this legislation does pass. My congratulations to the sponsor, Representative Chandru. Is that a motion?
Motion to 10-minute recess, seeing a natural break in debate.
Any seconds? Do I see any objections? Okay, seeing none, we will move to a 10-minute recess. I ask that you be back by 4:08. Sorry, I'm Eastern time, so I gotta do the math there.
Can we take a split, please? Just so I know what to prep, because I feel like I might speak last on this next one.
All those with an affirmation on the TPP bill, please raise your placard. Okay, that's 5. All those with a negation, please raise your placard. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, it's solid.
One person would have to flip though.
It's 5-6, so I think we only have 11 people speaking.
The negation cycle will repeat twice, but that's it.
Either going to be 5-6 or 6-5. Like
5-6.
Either way, it's the same thing essentially.
Chances are we're going to reach the 3rd piece of legislation as well, correct? I don't think we can just indefinitely recess, so it might be a good idea to not have everyone speak on the next one, so that we do have to.
I just want to remind the chamber that we also have 10 minutes of recess left, and we only
have to debate for 2 hours and 20 minutes as well, with including our 2 recesses.
I thought it was 2:30.
2 hours 30.
2 hours 20. So yeah, we could just take another 10-minute recess at the end if necessary.
Yeah, because it's 2 hours 20 is the minimum limit. So then if we just take a 10-minute recess after we're done with the second bill, we can then adjourn after.
Yeah, even if a few people get that 3rd speech, and judges generally look for quality over quantity, right?
So just in case that was something you guys wanted, in fairness, I just want to remind you guys that. But it's all up to you guys, because you guys run this thing. We have 1 minute left in this recess, so I ask that everyone start heading back. We're still waiting for 2 competitors. Representative Guan and Mazumdar, if you could turn your cameras on if you are there. I'll give them a couple seconds, but then we're just gonna have to go ahead and begin.
Quick question for the PO. What time does this round end?
It ends at 5:25 Central Time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and begin. Hopefully Representative Guan can make his way back as soon as possible. At 4:08, there he is. I called this debate back into session. We are now on a bill surrounding the TPP. Do we have an author on the floor? Do we have a sponsor? Representative Karbassian, unopposed.
I thank the chair. That is Representative Karbassian, K-A-R-B-A-S-S-I-A-N. Judges, just give me a signal if you're not ready. Otherwise, I will begin once I have my timer. And then PO, you're good? Awesome. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is vital, not only for our domestic political issues, but also for our standing in the international community, and that is why I urge you to affirm today. But first, what is the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Well, it's a trade agreement between Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, and the United States, along with some other countries. And it was signed into effect in February of 2016. Now, in January of 2017, President Donald Trump left that agreement. Let's take a look at why that had such a negative impact on our standing in the international community. The US has a lot of trading partners, and our number one is China. Now, the hole that we left when we left the TPP, China tried to fill and is filling in the status quo. As they created the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, formed in 2020, approximately 3 years after we left that agreement. And Brookings reports in November of 2020 that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP, could improve access to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative funds, enhancing gains from market access by strengthening transport, energy, and communication links between those countries. Now, a lot of the countries in that agreement are our allies. Countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea are all a part of that agreement. And they joined that agreement because of the vacuum the United States left when we left that agreement. Essentially, what this does is it allows China's influence to grow in those countries. It allows their standing on the world stage to cast a shadow over the United States. It allows them to continue the debt trapping they do with those lower income countries, essentially with the support of our allies, all because we left the TPP back in 2017. This continues because our allies want us to rejoin the TPP. As Wall Street Journal reports in April of 2021, that Japan, a loyal ally of the United States on security issues, has been pushing for us to join back because they know how important it is for the United States to maintain control of that trade agreement, how important it is for us to maintain our influence in the Southeast Asian Sea and to prevent China's influence from proliferating as it did when we left this agreement. Secondly, it is important domestically. Now, essentially, this agreement helps the US economy because it establishes stronger trade relations with numerous other countries. As the United States, as Trade Benefits America in 2014 reports that in 2014, US trade and exports of goods and services with TPP countries supported an estimated 1.9 million jobs in the state of California, with $71.5 billion worth of goods to TPP countries exported in 2014. That is a huge number, and that's a single state. This is the type of trade that the majority of our large states were conducting through this agreement. And we left like that in 2017, allowing China to fill the void. So representatives, when you vote on today's bill, I urge you to think about the effect internationally and the effect domestically that this has on our constituents and on our standing in the world stage. Affirm.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 7 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of 2 minutes of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Guan.
Oh, sorry about that. I forgot to unmute. All right, hi, Representative. That was a great speech. So is the Trans-Pacific Partnership in force?
It is enforced, but not the U.S. So those
No, right now the entire agreement is defunct. It's not in force right now.
I don't believe that's correct, to be quite honest with you, but if you continue.
Yeah, so my question is, what does rejoining it do in that case?
So rejoining, well, even if it's not established in the status quo, all we need to do is essentially draw up the older agreements, reform them for the contemporary time right now, and rejoin it that way.
Isn't it just a waste of time to rejoin an agreement?
Given the effect I showed you with China.
Thank you, Chair. So in 2017, when the US pulled out of the TPP, then the other countries that we were going to be in it with made the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. What's the difference between the labor and environmental standards in the revised versus the original TPP?
I'm not entirely sure, but I assume you'll tell me.
Yeah, so the labor standards were significantly decreased, environmental standards were thrown out the window, and Biden administration has even said that they're not willing to join the TPP as it stands because of those failures in the renegotiated
plan. I would argue that by joining, we're going to have a lot more influence on those labor standards, because when we join, all we have to do is to leave again to reform it.
Thank you. What was the reason why we left the TPP in the first place?
I believe President Trump cited unfair trade agreements.
Right. So what specifically happened to employment that made us leave?
I assume you'll tell me.
Yeah, we lost millions of jobs. Why did that happen?
I seriously doubt we lost millions of jobs after less than 1
year. If you'd like to
year.
submit an evidence challenge, I can provide it for you. Back in 2015, we lost 2 million jobs as a
that agreement wasn't in effect in 2015.
What is the difference?
Representative, that agreement was not in effect in 2015. It was established in February of 2017.
But we still traded with the TPP country.
Representative Chandru.
Representative, great speech, but I have a question. Have free trade agreements actually served to benefit us or harm us?
Given the effects I've shown specifically in California and other large states, the effects have shown to benefit us.
So what happened during the COVID-19 crisis? What did the US repent?
The majority of world economy suffered.
Right, especially the United States, because so much of its production was offshore, right?
Yes, but we also had huge internal lockdowns, and you can't deny that had an enormous effect.
So those free trade agreements that you say benefited us, which actually harmed us during the COVID-19 pandemic and any other sort of recession,
are you not
to help us?
We had huge lockdowns in our urban areas, which can.
Right, but Representative,
The clock has elapsed. Speaker may be seated. We're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Chandru unopposed.
I thank the chair. Hi, everyone. This is Representative Chundru for the second time today, fourth time today, second time this session. Any indication when you guys are ready, I'll gladly begin. I spoke second to last in the previous bill, if that helps. Perfect. Okay. George Berkeley is known for his notions on perception. According to Berkeley, there's no such thing as hot or cold, good or bad, real or unreal. It all comes down to your decision on how you choose to perceive it. In today's debate, it all comes down to your decision on how you choose to perceive our working class. Representative Carbassian, choose to perceive the working class as this Congress's priority, not the 1%, and fail this legislation. First, fail this legislation to keep manufacturing in the United States. This is because during the COVID-19 outbreak, we saw just how much the United States relies on its poor free trade agreements. But the National Public Radio on March 3rd of 2021 tells us that nearly 3/4 of US manufacturing facilities for medicine and technology sold in the United States are located in other countries as a result of free trade agreements. Essentially, these free trade agreements have only served to hurt us, making more and more of our companies go offshore, taking away millions of jobs. This shows us that the United States relies too heavily on its import, which is leading experts to call for change. In fact, the Foreign Policy Institute on March 18th of 2021 asked global thinkers for their predictions for a world post-pandemic, and most of them said that we should be pushing for local, decentralized ownership and co-creation of social goods and services. My constituents lost their jobs, their houses, their healthcare, and their families during this pandemic. And now the affirmation wants to send more jobs overseas? It's because if you ever want to be prepared for another global crisis, another recession, or any other catastrophe that excludes the United States, it's time that we fail this legislation. If you pass this legislation, you perpetuate the narrative that the 99% lose to the 1%, 100% of the time, because the only people that are ever prepared for global crisis are the ones that can afford to live through it. And that is not my constituents in Cleveland, Ohio. Second, fail this legislation to protect against stolen intellectual property. The Northwestern Journal for International Law and Business in 2018 tell us that many developing countries like Malaysia don't have laws to protect patents, inventions, and new processes. These laws don't have these strictly enforced mechanisms in the United States. And as a result, corporations that end up going offshore to these places in these countries have their ideas stolen. Keep in mind, Malaysia is an example of a TPP country, but Reuters on July 11th of 2020 tell us that in many countries like Malaysia, Mexico, the Brunei Darussalam, the protection of intellectual property is still patchy and underdeveloped. It's literally non-existent. All of those are TPP countries, and if all of our companies or any of them go offshore, they're severely underprotected. It's because I cannot and will not and never stand on this Congress floor and argue that American businesses should be robbed of their ideas overseas. It's imperative to fail this legislation that only serves to harm the working class. Use your perception and choose to view the working class as the most important. Fail this legislation for them.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. We're now in line for 2 minutes of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative Carbassian.
Representative, didn't I show you in my speech that in California alone, over almost 2 million jobs were created because of the TPP?
So, Representative, let me tell you what the TPP actually did for intellectual property. The domestic value of the stolen intellectual property is between 250 billion and 300 billion annually.
That doesn't simply just offset the over.
Representative, if millions of our companies are moving overseas, the jobs move overseas, they end up losing them.
Representative, if we had 2 million jobs created in one state alone, do you really believe that is
one small example? Whereas most of our companies are overseas, the jobs end up staying overseas.
Okay, moving on.
Representative Lynn.
Hi, so companies can choose to go to countries with lax restrictions, like laxer IP laws, right? Isn't that their choice? Like they're going to those countries.
Right, but I'm not going to sit by and make it so that they can lose almost $300 billion annually and just do nothing about it. In fact, I'd rather keep production domesticated.
So first of all, why do these free trade agreements encourage outsourcing, like you say? Like, what is the warranty?
Because it's way cheaper to get labor outside of the United States, because they can take advantage of lax labor laws.
That's before free trade agreements too, right? That already exists.
Representative, it's a lot easier with free trade agreements.
Representative N.
Okay, so sure, this legislation creates some outsourcing, so you lose jobs to
No, lots of outsourcing, considering that it's considerably cheaper to outsource labor. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so basically it also increases trade, right?
Increasing trade is a very minute impact for the point that we're losing.
The whole point of the agreement is that the whole point of the agreement that we increase all this trade, and that also means we're exporting more, meaning we need more jobs domestically.
Representative,
that's those exports.
Right. If millions of our jobs are moving overseas, we're seeing that the economic impact of the negation outweighs the ones of the affirmation.
Yeah, but domestic jobs skyrocket because you're exporting.
Representative Hassanali.
Hi, Representative. Can you tell me a little bit about our current trade relationship with Japan, who is one of the member countries?
You can go ahead and tell me.
Yeah, so a lot of our exports of specifically grains and meats go to Japan. Okay. Now that we're out of this agreement, those very farmers are struggling because the demand has dropped, right? Okay, so then how does your contention of the working class even stand?
While I sympathize with you about the farmers in Japan, my first and foremost priority is the American working class people, and I've seen just how bad.
Yeah, they're American farmers.
Okay, even with American farmers, right now, what I've seen is that millions of jobs are displaced when we actually do free trade agreements.
Collapsed.
I thank the chair.
The chair thanks you. Representative Guan, did you drop out or did you just turn your camera off?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. My internet just gave up on me all of a sudden.
Okay.
I think it's good now.
I was like, wait, are we missing someone for a second? Okay, that was good. Good thing you came back before this next cycle. Okay. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation, all affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. Once again, all affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. Do you have any motion? Representative Hassan Ali?
No, I can give the affirmative speech. Okay. I thank the chair. That is Representative Hassan Ali speaking for the second time in today's debate on the affirmation. Once again, any indication if you're not ready, you need a second. Okay, I'll get started. President Harry Truman used to keep a sign on his desk that read, "The buck stops here." It was a reminder that the President of the United States has to make decisions and ultimately accept responsibility for them. But in today's debate, the buck will not stop at the president's desk. It'll stop at ours, because it's time that we hold ourselves accountable to the economic relationships that we have lost, but also the impact on Americans who are already struggling in the status quo. Now, firstly, we are going to pass today's legislation to strengthen our dominance on the international stage, especially compared to China. Now, Representative Korbasian tried to bring this up, but allow me to further the impacts. Economist Kimberly Amadeo writes for The Balance just last month that notably, the TPP excludes China. That's deliberate because it was meant to balance the trade dominance of both China and India and Asia. The TPP would have given the United States an excuse to intervene in trade disputes in the oil-rich South China Sea. Fundamentally, withdrawing from the TPP reduced our leverage and influence, especially with dealing with China. Representative Chundru wants to talk about protection of intellectual property. There is no better example of a country who is violating those standards than China. How does today's legislation provide solvency for that problem? We rejoin and we enlarge the TPP so we are able to participate and lead with the combined influence of the US, Japan, and South Korea. That offers each country the opportunity to strengthen their economic viability without relying on China to do so. Now, I also need to address an incredibly large misconception that Representative Guan brought up during questioning by saying that the TPP is not enforced in the status quo. That's actually false, because right after the US pulled out, those very countries continued with the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. But next, pulling out of the TPP has specifically hurt our relationships with Japan. And unfortunately, those impacts fall on vulnerable rural farms. Representative Kerbasian told you that Japan is pushing for us to rejoin, but he didn't tell you why. The LA Times tells us that American exports of grain, meats, and other goods are the biggest, and they have taken a hit. Japan is now starting to import substantially more from the other free trade partners at America's expense. What impact does that have? Farmers are literally urging this Congress. The very farmers that have seen cash prices plunge 25% since last fall are literally pleading to us. Give us some relief. We are not surviving the way it is. See, representatives, this sword of hope means nothing for our people if a shield of protection and stability does not follow after. It is time that this Congress finally understands its duties, because after 250 years, we have continually let down the people that elected us in. When you cast your vote, remember where the buck stops. Pass this bill.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise up this time. That's going to go to Representative Chandru that's going to go to Representative Guan, who just raised his placard.
Hi.
Before I start, can everyone hear me okay? I know I was having internet troubles before. Wonderful, thank you. Okay, hi, Representative, that was a great speech. So
thank you.
The Comprehensive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership is a functionally different agreement from the original Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do you agree with that?
Okay, so it's different in a couple ways, but it's also similar. One of the ways it's similar is it includes the same member countries working in the same free trade agreement.
Mm-hmm. But do you agree that the clauses are different? Because the clauses are different.
Well, fundamentally, it doesn't include the United States. So obviously, yes, it's different in that sense.
But if the original agreement isn't enforced, what will rejoining it do?
Well, we're going to rejoin these member countries into this free trade agreement.
Hi, Representative. Just out of curiosity, what's the impact of joining this on the cost of drugs based on the academic rights that Representative Chandra was talking about?
I'm not sure. Why don't you tell me?
It makes it so that generic drugs skyrocket, particularly in vulnerable countries. How can we join this trade agreement that causes so much harm?
Because fundamentally, the US is also very powerful in our pharmaceutical industry. Our involvement can help lower those drug prices for some of these countries.
Because our healthcare industry is already suffering so much with COVID, can we—
That questioning block has elapsed. The speaker may be seated.
I thank the chair.
The chair thanks you. We're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. Once again, all negation. Representative Guan.
I thank the chair. Again, for the reference to the chamber, I'm Representative Guan. That's still spelled G-U-A-N. I'm speaking for the second time in this session on the negation of this resolution. Can I please get a thumbs up or nod from all the judges, PO, and parliamentarian whenever you're ready? Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Pin the PO really quick. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Sorry, my computer's giving me a bit of a hard time. Wonderful. Trade is something that benefits each and every nation around the world. Today, it has become more and more important in our ever globalized world. However, our country is currently missing out. Globalization is inevitable, and if today's debate is to have any substance, we must recognize that simple fact. With that said, globalization and all the benefits that come with it will only occur in the negative world. Because first, understand that, as Representative Hassanali completely fails to recognize, there is a revamped version of the TPP, completely different from the original, and there is no reason why we aren't joining that agreement instead. Representative Hassanali, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, is a completely different agreement from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so the original agreement is not actually in force. The new agreement fosters trade between 11 different countries around the Pacific, and our absence from the new agreement has heavily impacted our agricultural industry. Listen to CNBC in 2018 when it writes that the goods produced by non-CPTPP members like the United States are now expected to be more expensive and less competitive in the 11 member countries, which account for 13% of the global GDP. In fact, according to Matthew P. Goodman, the Senior Vice President for Economics at the CSIS, due to the new agreement, Australian agricultural producers will only need to pay 9% tariff for exporting to Japan, for example, while US producers need to pay a base tariff of 38%, making our goods completely uncompetitive in member countries. Economic competitiveness is crucial, because without it, farmers in our country are hurt the hardest. According to a report made by PBS in 2019, the US-China trade war has plunged the value of exports of grains and soybeans due to tariffs. We rely heavily on our farmers to put food on the table for hundreds of millions of people worldwide. By failing this resolution and joining the CPTPP instead, you help the economic industry regain, agricultural industry regain economic stimulus. This stimulus is extremely important right now, because according to the Columbia Law School, that amount of profit is especially important for during the pandemic. The Columbia Daily Tribune reported in April of 2021 that farmers collectively lost $20 billion in 2020. And right now we have to make sure that they bounce back. The affirmative rule provides nothing for these farmers. But next, the CPTPP is inherently superior because whether we like it or not, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a defunct agreement. Although we were the only country that actually withdrew, the agreement is not in effect, meaning that rejoining the agreement would mean absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, the new agreement is already in effect, and its trading agreements are even more comprehensive than its predecessor. In fact, according to the Government of Canada, a current member, once fully implemented, 99% of trade lines among parties will be duty-free. That means that without joining, the US is currently missing out in key sectors of trade. But once we join the agreement, we no longer need to fear tariffs and will make our goods far more competitive on the international stage. Ultimately, we'll be able to boost both exports and exports, benefiting all our citizens. Representative Carbassian, economic stimulus for our countries lies in the CPTPP, not its predecessor. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a defunct agreement, and if we want to make today's debate substantial, we must recognize that. Meanwhile, there is a far better alternative, and once we brush away the affirmations rhetoric, we will be able to see that the CPTPP will far better serve our nation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Rodriguez.
So let's talk about the CPTPP for a moment. So
Yes.
the difference is that certain articles were suspended or revoked, correct?
Yeah, and then, as I mentioned in my speech, a lot of the trading agreements are even more comprehensive.
Right, but the problem with the problem you have with it is that key provisions that we need are gone, right?
Well, it's not that key provisions we need. I'm just saying that in the new agreement, it's a lot more comprehensive.
Right, but in the new agreement, like weren't a lot of the things simply suspended because we weren't there? Like if we rejoin, wouldn't they be reinstated?
I mean, perhaps.
Representative Mazumdar.
What happens when we pass this resolution?
As I was saying in my speech, nothing, because the agreement we're planning on joining with this resolution is
Right.
defunct.
It's a statement of intent saying we're going to reverse our Trump policies and we're willing to work with you again towards a trade agreement. Why
Yeah,
is
but while we're doing that, we might as well
Let me
rejoin
ask
the
my
new
question. That's my question. Why is starting a dialogue about trade agreements a bad thing?
Oh, it's not a bad thing, but what I'm saying is that when we're at it, we might as well rejoin the new agreement.
So your sole problem is that you want this resolution to say CPTPP instead of TPP?
Thank you. That
Essentially,
question
because
clock has elapsed. Speaker may be seated. We're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. Once again, all affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. Do you have any motions? Okay. Representative Pang,
Motion for a really quick 30-second in-house recess.
do you have any seconds? Do we have any objections? Okay, so seeing none, we'll go ahead and move to a 30-second recess.
I'm working on one. I just need like a little more time.
Okay, is there anyone else? Who else was going to go after? Because so far we've had like two. Yeah.
Wait, Representative Rodriguez, will you be ready for this cycle or like that one after?
Like I'm probably gonna need another cycle.
Okay, because that's what I was saying too. Because I'm on F as well, and I'd prefer to go like one cycle after. But is there anyone else on F?
I believe you two were it because it was like one extra on the neg.
It was supposed to.
Okay. You know, I'll figure it out. Cool. I'll go. That's fine.
Okay, that recess has elapsed. Unless, barring any other motions, I'll go ahead and move to the negation of this legislation. Are there any negation speakers?
Point of order.
Yes, Representative Smith.
Would you be able to call one more time for affirmation speeches?
Oh, okay. I thought you guys wanted to skip that cycle. Once again, I call for a speech on the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. Representative N, unopposed.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Representative Nagarjuna, or Representative N again, speaking for the second time today. Again, I'm just going to assume everyone's ready. If not, please let me know. For the past few years, our government has operated under the assumption that the only way to advance America's interests is through doing things on our own. But as we've seen time and time again, with the trade war, with NATO, and with the Paris Climate Accord, the more we try and distance ourselves from the rest of the global community, the more we hand up our own country and our citizens. Don't let petty politics prevent countless families from putting food on the table. Too much of this debate has been centered around how this is going to impact this nation or that country's entire economy. For 3 minutes, I want to zoom in on the human economy. Primarily, this chamber needs to understand how the trade war has devastated our agricultural industry. Representative Guan on the negation already explains how we've lost exports because of China, but data from the International Trade Administration in 2020 elaborates that farm income is projected to fall to a 25-year low, and it will take years for the industry to recover. Representative Chandru framed his entire speech around protecting the domestic industry, but joining the TPP and passing this legislation will actually remedy that deficit. That's because the U.S. International Trade Commission in December of 2018 explained that once the U.S. joins the TPP, agricultural exports would increase by nearly $20 billion. Joining the TPP isn't just a matter of saving American exports, because if we don't act quickly enough, there won't be any exports left to save. The U.S. Wheat Association writes in October of 2018 that because of the trade war, American wheat is becoming more expensive than wheat anywhere else in the world. This means that America is losing its first position as a first choice for importers. Representative Chundru, if you want to protect American workers and ensure that they aren't losing their job, make sure that the industry they depend on for employment isn't in late-stage collapse. Joining the TPP not only gives preferential treatment to our wheat exports, but it also removes any duties or tariffs, which makes our exports cheaper. Representative Guan, that doesn't just increase employment. Lower prices increase demand, so existing workers are actually paid more and get better work environments, Representative Chundru, the same workers that you're concerned about. And as it turns out in the long term, having allies around the globe allows our agricultural industry to thrive, even amidst economic crises. But why is increasing exports so important? It prevents farms from closing. Representative Guan tells us that the affirmation world offers nothing for farmers, but it's actually quite the opposite, because before we increase exports by passing, the USDA wrote that in the 2019 pre-pandemic world, US farm debt reached a record high of $416 billion. As farms struggle to stay afloat, a record number of them filed from bankruptcy. Countless families in the Midwest America have worked in agriculture for their entire lives. If they lose their farms, they lose their paychecks, their homes, and their livelihoods. Your signature is either on this bill or their farm's foreclosure. You make the choice. When this Congress justifies isolationism by saying we want to prioritize American interests, we really mean our interests, not our people's. And that's what you change when you affirm.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative Chundru.
Representative, great speech, but I have a question. Now, Representative Hassan on your side already told you that the wheat's declining because of us not having a trade agreement with Japan, right?
It's not just Japan, right? It's like all these different industries.
It's all of these different. Okay, so we trade wheat with all of these different industries. Can you?
No, I tell you agriculture in general, and then give you like one statistic about wheat, right? It's
all right. So why can't we have like smaller individual free trade agreements instead of joining a huge free trade agreement?
Why not join one that increases our exports by $20 billion?
Because it makes smaller ones. Why would you do that when you're actually like offshoring so many more jobs and stopping like domestic production?
It really makes up that deficit.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Chair. So let's talk about, I want to actually build off of what Chundru was talking about. Is it more beneficial for the US to have bilateral trade agreements, one country to the next, instead of joining a free trade agreement that we didn't actually have any say in negotiating?
Okay, so the whole point of big trade agreements like the TPP or like CTPP is because you can't go around with like 14, 15 different nations like these agreements facilitate and be like one by one have these trade agreements. It is way easier to increase with way more.
Isn't that what we're doing in the status quo?
Agreements.
That's the Biden administration.
The block has elapsed. Speaker may be seated. We're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. That's Representative Smith speaking for the second time this legislative session. Just so the PO is aware, I am timing myself. I've had a little bit of internet difficulty, so I want to make sure that I'm able to see and hear everything the whole time. All right, everyone looks like they are good. We've all heard the saying, teamwork makes the dream work, but former President Trump pulled the US out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017, and we missed out on teaming up to free trade in the Asian Pacific region. Unfortunately, this loss of participation cannot be reversed by joining the TPP, despite what the affirmative has worked to convince you thus far in the debate. So let's go down the flow and explain why we fail. First, Representative Karbasian, you first spoke about the RCEP and China's grasp for economic influence when the US left the TPP with that vacuum that was created. But what you failed to explain, however, is that the RCEP has inferior labor standards to the TPP, and that the countries previously interested in being a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership have now left and been able to produce their goods with more lax labor laws as well as more lax environmental regulations. If we were to pass this legislation, we, in order to join back into the comprehensive TPP, would be asking those countries to go to the negotiated levels under the TPP, which failed. If they are currently producing things with more relaxed labor laws and lower environmental standards, they don't have an incentive to let us back into the program, and we don't have an incentive to join a program that we didn't have any any say in creation. Moreover, the countries that left the US when we chose to leave the TPP, both myself and Representative Hassan Ali brought up they have lower labor standard. But Guam tried picking at this and questioning, asking for the differences. Let me give them to you. The difference between the CPTPP and the TPP, lots of letters here, I apologize, is that the environmental pollution standards for manufacturing are below the levels required by the United Nations, as well as the labor standards. And as Representative Chandu brought up, 11 of the 20 articles on intellectual property were completely stricken, meaning that if the United States were to rejoin the TPP, we're losing our intellectual property advantage that we previously would have held. Now, the US has no ground to rejoin the TPP because it no longer exists. The two plans left in its wake, the RCEP and the comprehensive plan, failed to set pollution emission regulations, failed to uphold environmental policy, and failed to meet the needs of our country. Therefore, we cannot affirm. Now, there's still solvency on the negation if we fail this legislation. The US is able to pursue bilateral agreements in line with the Biden administration and what we've been doing with our international policy thus far in the administration. But don't believe me, Representative Hassan Ali, you brought up Japan and questioning to Chandu. Let's talk about Japan and talk about the benefits of bilateral trade. In the World Economic Forum's recent Asian Society Policy Institute paper, Re-engaging Asian Pacific on Trade, it was recommended that the Biden administration look at narrower sectoral deals in the first step to engaging in its Asian Pacific trade. We identify 3 areas that would seem not to be only in the US interest, but also in the interest of our Asian trading partners, including climate change, trade, digital trade, and medical supply chains, the issues that are impactful, especially during the COVID pandemic. A bilateral approach in line with what the Biden administration has been doing will work better and allow us to create deals that have environmental and labor policies that we were originally putting in place when drafting the TPP. This legislation doesn't fit our needs. We must fail it for these reasons.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative Carbassian.
Representative, did you say Japan actually left the comprehensive agreement with China?
I didn't say that they left that agreement. No, I was saying that after
falling apart, right?
Say that again.
You said it was falling apart, right?
Japan and China's relations?
No, the comprehensive agreement that they're in together.
The comprehensive RCEP, Japan and China have had increased trade through that, but the US is not going to be able to join that trade agreement since it's primarily headed by China.
Representative, but what I am saying is we need to counter China's influence by rejoining this agreement.
We're not going to rejoin policy that's below the labor standards that we're holding our own.
Representative Lynn.
Hi, so it's kind of bad that all these 12 countries are like going under laxer IP, environmental and workers' rights laws, right?
Yeah, it's not helpful for us, and it honestly is an embarrassment on the global stage that we pulled out of an agreement that would have been better.
Isn't the only way to fix that to rejoin trade talks to re-enter the old deal?
No, so since they're currently operating with those low environmental and labor standards, they're not incentivized to go to higher standards if the US were to join, because we're not able to give them any real benefits.
But why not? That's why they implemented them in the first place, and we did want to join. If we wanted to join again, wouldn't we have those negotiations?
So that's when that power grasp with the
questioning block has unfortunately elapsed. We will never know the answer to that question. We are now in line for a speech in the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. That'll go to Representative Rodriguez, unopposed.
I thank the chair. For the second and presumably final time in this session, that is Christian Rodriguez. Whenever you're ready. Okay. Awesome. Everyone looks ready, so I'll be good to go. The Trump administration's idea of America first on the surface seems like a pretty good idea. This idea that we always make sure Americans, their jobs will be prioritized over globalist trade policies. But in actuality,
can anyone else hear him? Okay. Representative Rodriguez. We missed that, so I'm gonna allow you to start over again because your audio cut out. Okay. All the judges.
That is quite embarrassing.
Well, we didn't hear anything.
Yeah.
Okay. All the judges good? Yeah. Okay. You're ready to begin at any time, Representative Rodriguez. Well. Okay, so since he was going to speak, I'm going to give a couple minutes for him to rejoin. If those minutes expire, I'm going to move to the parley and ask him what we should do. But yes, Representative Tyler.
Yeah, point of inquiry. I know that Tab was talking about how we have to discuss how to go into low internet mode, but I think we should have that discussion now to make it easier for Representative Rodriguez.
So
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry about that. That was kind of embarrassing. I just switched Wi-Fi networks. So I was on a hotspot before. I'm on my actual Wi-Fi because it was acting up earlier. So I should be good to go. Sorry about the delay. So should I start all over again or?
Before you begin, I just want to I want to go back to Representative Tyler's point and just ask the parley if we should still look into that.
What I've done in the past is ask everyone to shut their cameras off. The problem is we have a live stream going on, so we have to have people going all the time. Whatever you decide to do, I'm down with, but keep in mind the overarching thing that this is a publicly viewed event and we have to allow the public to see what we're doing. So,
okay. So seeing as you switched, Representative Shinju, do you have a?
No, I was just gonna say he like looks perfect right now. So
that's what I was say. Seeing as you changed Wi-Fi networks, we'll give it one more shot, and then if not, we'll go to the cameras turning off.
Okay. Awesome. Take two. Let me know if you guys are ready. Then I am good to go. The Trump administration's idea of America First on the surface seemed like a pretty good idea, making sure American workers were prioritized, that globalist trade policies wouldn't be taken over American worker rights, and most importantly, we would always come first. But in actuality, we looked like the fools as farms started to close down, worker wages started to go down as well, and as a result, we suffered. Let's make sure we do course correction, rejoin the TPP, and affirm this resolution. The biggest problem with this debate so far has been the fundamental misunderstanding of how trade negotiations actually work. First of all, let's understand that as a Congress, we can't actually just join a treaty whenever we want. The Constitution only says we can ratify treaties, and the president itself can then enter them. We aren't actually entered in the TPP. The New York Times reports just in 2015 that when President, or rather in 2017, when President Trump left the TPP, that meant that if Congress were to ever pass a resolution such as that, it would simply result in us nudging him in that direction and nothing more. What does that mean in the context of this debate? That means all we do is we ask Biden to pursue negotiations for the TPP to re-enter and renegotiate it. But Senator Guan has a few problems because he thinks the TPP and the CPTPP are two completely different things and nothing will change. Here's the thing, Senator Guan. I read the exact same Center for Strategic and International Studies article you did. Here's the key part you left out. The provisions that you want that you apparently don't see are simply suspended. Basically meaning they took it out of the CPTPP because we weren't there. However, kept the possibility of them being re-added to negotiate with us and make sure it would incentivize us to actually join. So Representative Smith, when you have all of these concerns about environmental concerns, we can add those provisions back. Senator Chandru, when you're talking about IP theft being at an all-time high, rejoin, don't worry, those provisions will also be added back. So what does that leave left? The only clash that is truly left in this debate was the one all the way at the beginning between Representative Karbastan on my own side, who sponsored and said we would gain jobs, and then Representative Chandru on the negation, who said, no, they're going to go off seek. We're going to lose all of them. Who is correct? Well, in actuality, neither is correct, because the Peterson Institute for International Economics explains on July 7th of 2015, similar to what Representative N on my own side said, the net benefit or loss of jobs is essentially zero. However, what does happen is the jobs we gain on average pay 18% higher wages, making sure workers have more money in their pockets. Let's see why that is the most important impact in this round. A study by Christopher Ruffini from the UC Berkeley explains on June 4th of 2020 that boosted wages also increased productivity and reduced the likelihood of workplace death or injury. And she continues that a 10% increase in wages could save as many as 15,000 lives. That is why you affirm.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative Pang.
Thanks. So let's say we start renegotiating all of these different standards. Approximately how long is that going to take?
It varies. Probably, I would say like a year or two, maybe longer, maybe shorter.
Okay, so then why do we need to pass this resolution in order to start negotiating those standards?
Because Biden has been incredibly ambiguous as to whether or not he would rejoin. We're nudging him to actually be, yes, I want to rejoin.
Right. So then why is that necessary in order to conduct renegotiations?
Because he's not renegotiating it right now.
Representative Tyler.
Hi, Representative. Representative Biden has actually said he won't even consider new trade agreements until we build up our economy at home. How does this impact your argument?
I believe we're actually recovering from the pandemic pretty well. Like our economy's starting to get back on its feet.
So we haven't seen a trade surplus since the 70s. Shouldn't we be focusing at home before we look to these international trade agreements?
Well, first of all, like we don't lose jobs. Like that's a misconception. Second of all, like a trade deficit isn't inherently a bad thing, especially since we're a service-based economy, not a good-based economy.
Thank you, Representative.
That questioning block has elapsed. Speaker may be seated. We're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Pang.
Thank you. Can everyone see and hear me okay? Great. This is Representative Pang, spelled P-A-N-G, speaking for the second and probably last time today at the Leisure of All. Pio, once again, I have you pinned, so if you could just let me know whenever everyone else is ready.
You're good to go.
Great. Former President Trump's favorite movie is Home Alone, not because of the plot, but because he was able to get a cameo in it. Now it seems like today's Congress has the same inclination. We are opening our door to more trade, but leaving our own Americans home all alone. Stand with me in the negation. First, because this legislation pushes small businesses out of the market. Representative Karbasian tells you that TPP is going to be increasing competition, but that only helps larger companies, not the small businesses that our economy is relying on. As the Small Business Exporters Association finds, 15% of small businesses have reported being harmed by free trade agreements when they're forced to compete against larger foreign companies that they don't stand a chance against. Then, as Brookings continues, on May 21st, in an analysis of data from 450,000 small business consumers, small businesses have lost 25 to 60% of their revenue due to COVID-19. So, Representative Rodriguez, we're actually not recovering from COVID-19 just yet. As small businesses, which literally make up half of our economy, are on the verge of collapse, this legislation only puts the final nail in their coffin. Representative Karbasian, we don't see any of your positive economic benefits trigger when small businesses are the ones taking the hit. But the second reason why you're going to stand with me in the negation is because it increases labor exploitation in developing countries. I'm surprised that with a huge trade agreement like this, we haven't even begun to consider how labor standards are going to change in other countries. Allow me to draw that out for you. As the Brookings Institute finds on September 1st, free trade agreements increase demand. So, as a result, companies' products are able to be sold easier now to foreign consumers. To match that demand, they need more supply, so they increase production in their manufacturing plants. However, those plants aren't mainly in the US or in the UK. They're in developing countries where labor is exponentially cheaper and there's little to no regulation or oversight. To streamline production, companies exploit their workers, forcing them to work long hours for little pay, and they can't even fight back because they can be easily replaced. The International Labor Organization finds that this hurts our most vulnerable, as 152 million children are actively involved in child labor. Representative Nagarjuna, when we increase the demand for our products, it's built on the back of forced labor. And Representative Rodriguez, we can renegotiate before we rejoin, but just because we establish higher labor standards doesn't mean that countries have to follow them. Representative Hassan Ali, All of the economic success you see is going to be filled by children in other countries, not by set manufacturing plants with high enough labor standards. Fail this legislation to close the door on bad policy.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative N.
Okay, so in the status quo and in like both worlds, that like poor labor jobs in other countries exist, right?
Right.
But we are just increasing them when you outsource jobs. But what me and Representative Rodriguez tell you is that it's a net zero, but our jobs get all of a sudden better wages, better work environments.
Yeah, the issue is that you're worsening the labor standards and forced labor in other countries.
No, you're not. You just admitted it stays the same. It's just more jobs there.
It doesn't stay the same because when you increase demand for products, they have to increase
Representative Rodriguez.
Yeah, let's continue that line of questioning. So if the TPP is already in place for other countries, aren't these children like currently being exploited like as we speak?
Yes, they are.
So then what changes? Like they're going to be exploited regardless if you pass or fail?
No, because now consumers in the United States are able to buy foreign products significantly easier because we don't have to pay tariffs for them anymore.
Do you have a number on like how many extra people would be exploited?
You can't find that kind of statistic because there's no way to
So
measure.
why should we weigh that against the lives the affirmative has proved you save?
We'll never know the answer to that question because that question block has elapsed. We're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. Representative Lin, unopposed.
Thank the chair. That's Representative Lin, just spelled L-I-N. I spoke fifth on the previous bill, so whenever y'all are ready. Awesome. Great. Exclusionary trade practices and protectionism haven't looked good for America for the past few decades. When you try and shut out every single other business export and import and pride yourself on the fact that America can do this by itself, you are not only willfully ignorant, but denying opportunities to the very citizens who live in your country. It is exactly because the TPP is what American businesses and civilians need that you pass today's legislation. There's only one big question that we need to answer in today's debate. Are American businesses, big or small, harmed? Representative Carbasi and Hassan Ali and Rodriguez all say no. And the only true response to outsourcing comes from Representative Chundru at the very start of this bill, citing that the American companies would rather go elsewhere. But the basis of his arguments are predicated on other countries' markets becoming more attractive to companies after we rejoin the TPP and leading to a loss of American corporations who opt to go overseas. Here's why it's dangerous to apply the same logic of general free trade agreements to the TPP, because they're fundamentally different. Countries are more likely to move overseas in the status quo than once you pass this bill, because it's harder to sell your products in America when you're not in the TPP. The Atlantic in March of 2018 explains that in many CPTPP countries, because we didn't join in the first place, they have protective measures implemented against American companies. These tariffs increase prices for American exports. For example, they increased them by 59% for US autopilot manufacturers and 40% for US poultry. But Representative Peng says that this would also affect small businesses differently because they can't compete regardless. But they become even more competitive when barriers to importing and exporting foreign go down. This agreement would have eliminated over 11,000 tariffs on goods to the United States exports by 2030 and would have increased annual US exports by $357 billion by that year. In this status quo, when we have less protective measures against these foreign countries than they do against us, big and small American companies can't compete. That's why you break down the barriers and pass this legislation. But then Representative Peng tells us that we're only going to be relying more on unsavory business practices in foreign countries. Here's the problem with that. That's once again reliant on the very same logic that American companies get less competitive and that foreign companies get more competitive. The truth is, introducing American products and services worldwide only increases the reliance on American goods and services, not the other way around. But why is this so important? Because you retain American jobs and companies through globalization. If we rejoined and got rid of those taxes, companies wouldn't be penalized or disadvantaged for staying in the US. Here is the fundamental misconception the negation continues to make. Our domestic market is already open to the world, but the TPP tears down barriers to other markets so that we can finally compete fairly in them. That's why you pass.
Thank you for that speech of 2 minutes and 57 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise. That's going to go to Representative Smith.
Thank you, Chair. So Biden was Obama's vice president, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so during the Obama administration, they were going through all the different negotiations for the TPP originally. Biden was there for the majority of the conversations, correct? Okay, so if the Biden administration continues to have doubts that joining the TPP is in the best nature of our country and instead has made the international policy be one-on-one bilateral trade agreements, why are we continuing to push him when we're seeing that his message is working?
Right? Worst case scenario, we just don't rejoin and nothing happens. Best case scenario, we rejoin, renegotiate, and make the trade deal better.
Worst case scenario, we join and the liquor standards don't improve.
Representative Pang.
Thank you. So if I'm a consumer in a foreign country, am I more likely to purchase a product that is cheaper from a large company or from a small business from the US?
It's all about the comparative, right? I understand that big companies are always going to be more competitive than smaller companies, but American companies overall get more competitive because we have less protective measures than they do against us.
Right, but even if smaller companies no longer have to pay tariffs, don't they need actual consumers to buy their products in order to make a profit?
Right. I'm not saying that they're suddenly going to like outcompete big business. That's obviously not the case, but they do get more competitive. That's still a net benefit.
But don't they start losing?
Questioner and speaker. Speaker may be seated. We're now in line for a speech in the negation. All negation speakers, please rise at this time. That goes to Representative Tyler, unopposed.
I thank the chair. For the judges, that is Tyler, spelled Tyler, and this is my second time speaking this legislative session. If I could get some sort of indication when you're ready to go, that'd be wonderful. Awesome. Representatives, let's be honest. The economy is confusing. And while I may not be an economist, I know that rushing in is a negative for two key impacts that we've seen throughout this entire round. First, the inability to punish lax labor laws or renegotiate anything that we want. And second, the dangers of rushing in for our very own economy. Now, rejoining would leave us in a position where we're unable to punish nations that are using problematic tactics. Representative Chundru tells us so early on in this debate that jobs are going overseas, but let's expand on these issues. Representative Hassanali tells us that we need to look to Japan, but Japan is in fact participating in these very same issues that Representative Smith brought up almost 2 cycles ago and has been uncontested by the affirmation. Asian Times on October 16th of 2020 tells us there's bipartisan support for the use of tariffs against China or any other country perceived to be using mercantilist practices to, quote, steal American jobs. The problem with the TPP is that manufacturing has been migrating from China not to the United States, but to Southeast Asia, where wages are lower there and much of the industrial infrastructure is already in place thanks to decades of investment by the Japanese, Koreans, Europeans, and Americans. Japanese, Koreans, and also Chinese companies have moved production to China from China to Southeast Asia in response to rising Chinese wages because they want to continue to pay their workers low. Representative Pang already told us that these manufacturing jobs are built on the backs of child labor, but the problem is that we can't renegotiate this. Representative Smith already told us this, but Representative Rodriguez says that this isn't a possibility. That hubris and them wanting the American companies to join so desperately is misplaced. Asian Times on October 16th of 2020 further tells us that while they would welcome the US to join, they only welcome it if we don't demand extensive revisions to the agreement. Representative Smith already told us the agreement is far more lax than anything we would be possibly comfortable with, and they wouldn't allow us to rejoin because we already pulled out. But then, let's look to the fact that rushing in is bad. We do need to build trade up at home first. Once again, the source tells us that Joe Biden has written that he would not enter into any new trade agreements until we have invested in Americans and equipped them to succeed in a global economy. Representative Lynn, I agree. We absolutely need to provide opportunity, but we can only provide that opportunity when American economy is ready for it. Now, Representative Rodriguez and I discussed trade deficits. The fact is we haven't had a trade surplus since the 1970s. And while economists hypothetically say this isn't a negative, we can see continually in countries that do have trade surpluses like Japan, Germany, South Korea, and China that continue to grow, while those countries like ourselves that have trade deficits, that become increasingly dependent on these other countries, it is absolutely a negative. And then let's look to the final point, way back to the original speech of Representative Carbassian, telling us that China is filling in. This is a false pretense to enter. The Diplomat on January 14th of just this year tells us that China is really only saying this because they want to look to their own domestic policy. And if we choose to rush into this trade agreement, we will actually lose credibility with these Asian countries we are supposedly creating better relations with, because we have continually pulled out for our own domestic reforms. Because we aren't prepared, this only causes more damage. Thus, you must negate.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech of 3 minutes and 13 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise up this time. It's going to go to Representative Hassan Ali.
Good afternoon, Representative. So if we haven't had a trade surplus since the 70s, are we just going to wait another 50 years before joining another trade organization while we have the same conditions?
I'm not saying we have to wait another 50 years, but the fact is our economy is struggling desperately, and we need to look into more domestic reforms.
Okay, but Representative Rodriguez proved to us that the economy from COVID is recovering quite well for businesses. How does that impact that contention?
Representative, what I told you is the trade deficit's been existing for nearly half a century. That's not just COVID impacts.
Representative Mazumdar.
Why will other countries not rejoin the TPP?
They already are. They're not going to let us rejoin. We aren't the main negotiator here. We're asking their permission to rejoin this trade agreement. And if we demand extensive revisions that they won't comply to because they're getting cheaper wages and better labor practices for themselves, they're not going to let us in.
Okay, why did they join the TPP in the first place when we had all these stringent labor practices?
We pulled out, and now they're part of a new agreement that
They were willing to better their labor standards to work with us because we gave them billions. Why won't they do the same today when we pass?
As we look to the fact they do not trust their reliability.
That question block has elapsed. We're now in line for a speech on the affirmation. All affirmation speakers, please rise at this time. Representative Mazumdar.
Hi, everyone. Back again. Mr. Mazumdar, spelled the same way. Just give me a thumbs up and I'll get started. Okay. Great. Almost done. 1 second. Donald Trump was very excited to pull the US out of the TPP. He spoke about it for months and got it done on his first day. In an interview response, President Obama said actions like this made him worry about his legacy. And at the end of today's round, that's what I'd like for us to consider. For too long, we've let misplaced nationalism and protectionist policy erode a legacy of globalization and bilateral cooperation. Pass this bill and become the House which revitalize our economy for good. The most important argument that Negation makes today is that the TPP will produce wide-scale job outsourcing. This is championed by Representative Pang, Chandru, and Guan. A few responses to this. First, we need to stop blaming free trade agreements for outsourcing because it's inevitable, irrespective of our trade relationships. Companies will always find ways to lower the cost of production for what they produce. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2017 found that the number of US manufacturing jobs has decreased every single year since 1950 and will continue to do so. It's 1/4 of what it was at the start of World War II. But that's because labor markets shift, new skills are developed, and companies make goods cheaper, not because of the TPP. But I empathize with you, Representative Chandru. It's hard to tell your citizens who just lost their jobs to chalk it up to the inevitable march of globalization. So if you want to slow the rate of outsourcing, you should actually pass this bill. In questioning, I asked you, and you told me that companies go overseas because other countries have lax labor standards. And that's true, but the TPP actually fixes that. According to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative's labor report in 2015, the TPP has the strongest protections of workers for any trade agreement in history. The U.S. forced all of the countries, Brunei, Mexico, Vietnam, and Laos, which had lax labor laws, they all had to sign documents promising to eliminate forced labor, abolish child labor, enable unionization, and establish minimum wages. When we pulled out of the TPP, all of those good standards were largely scrapped, and Representative Smith on the Negation actually told you this. So to Representative Pang, Guan, and Chandru, who are worried about outsourcing jobs, I say this: outsourcing is inevitable. But if you're really worried about it, join the TPP, which betters working conditions, making labor more expensive and not worth outsourcing. Representative Nagarjuna and Rodriguez conceded to outsourcing and said it didn't matter. Representative Lin says companies won't go overseas because they want access to US markets. And I'm saying that we actually stop outsourcing by the negation's own warrant, bettering labor standards. This argument has been thoroughly beaten on every front. Next, Representative Tyler, you say that other countries won't rejoin the TPP because they need to tighten up their labor laws. If that's the case, why did Malaysia, Vietnam, Mexico, and Brunei all fix their labor laws to join it back in 2016? It's because they got billions in return. According to Kimberly Amadeo from the World Economic March in this year, all 12 countries involved got $305 billion more in US exports every single year. That was a good enough reason to pass then. It'll be the same when we affirm today. We can act today, but when the news breaks tomorrow, we don't control the headlines. History will judge us with the eye of hindsight, and it's up to us to pass nuanced, durable policy. In that effort, stand with me on the affirmation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All questioners, please rise at this time. That's going to go to Representative Rodriguez.
Hi, so let's talk about your point on about like outsourcing, right? So if in terms of like labor laws and past trade deals, and such as the USMCA and NAFTA, we always promised stronger labor regulations, just never enforced it. What's the difference with this?
Because this, the TPP actually put the ILO in charge of enforcing it. So we assigned it to an international body and it made them hold all of us accountable. That's why it's different from NAFTA. That's why it's different from the USMCA.
Okay, I'm also affirming, so cool.
Representative N.
Yeah, I'm affirming as well, but I'm just confused because there was an international body like the ILO in charge of not NAFTA, but the USMCA, and we still saw a lot of like labor issues, environmental issues that just kept happening. Why won't that happen?
So I would rather a world where the International Labor Organization lets some worker abuses go, as opposed to the negation, which has absolutely no accountability and where child labor is rampant. At
So
least
we can
this
confirm
legislation.
that having that international body does have some sort of decrease.
Yes, absolutely. At
Okay.
least this resolution gives the potential to decrease, and negation does absolutely nothing in response.
Thank you.
Thank you. That questioning block has elapsed. Speaker may be seated.
Thank you.
Seeing as every speaker has spoken on this piece of legislation, I'm going to unilaterally move to previous question. Representative Chandru.
Motion, wouldn't the proper one now just be orders of the day?
Well, we're going to vote on this legislation since we have time, and then we can move to orders of the day.
Okay.
All the representatives who wish to vote in the affirmation of this piece of legislation, please raise your placard and put it down when I call your name. Representative Karbassian, Representative N, Representative Mazumdar, Representative Lin, Representative Rodriguez, and Representative Hassanali. I count 6. All who wish to fail this piece of legislation, please raise your placard. Representative Chandru, Representative Tyler, Representative Pang, Representative Guan, and Representative Smith. I count 5. On a vote of 6-5, this legislation does indeed pass. My congratulations to the sponsor. Representative Rodriguez.
Seeing as everyone has spoken twice and we are 11 minutes away from our hard stop, I move to adjourn.
Point of inquiry.
Representative Chandru, state that.
Considering we actually tabled a piece of legislation, we'd have to move to orders of the day first and then vote on that piece of legislation because we've tabled it and then adjourn.
Okay, we can vote on that motion if you state a motion for that.
Motion to orders of the day.
Do we have any seconds? Okay, so we're gonna vote on that tabled legislation, which was
Single family zoning.
single-family zoning. So all who wish to pass single-family zoning, please raise your placard at this time. Representative Chandru, Representative Tyler, Representative Mazumdar, Representative Lin, Representative Hassanali, Representative Pang, Representative Smith, and Representative Guan. That's 8. All who wish to fail this piece of legislation, raise your placard at this time. Representative Karbassian. All who wish to abstain, please raise your placard at this time. Representative N and Representative Rodriguez. On a vote of 8-1-2, this legislation does pass. My congratulations to whoever the author of that legislation was. Okay, Representative Chandru.
I move to adjourn.
before we move to adjourn, I just want to state a couple things and then we'll move to adjourn. Okay, so in this round, we went through 22 speeches and 52 questions and passed 3 pieces of legislation. So we were a very efficient Congress today. So seeing that, I just have a couple things to say. One, to the judges, I am a competitor. So if you think I did a good job, rank me accordingly, or don't rank me at all if you think I did a terrible job. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move it to the parley. Congratulations, everyone, on a great round. Oh, actually, do we have a motion? Representative Chandru.
I motion to adjourn.
Do we have a second? Any opposed? Seeing as that was unanimous, we are going to, we are going to go ahead and adjourn. Thank you, everyone, and I'm handing it off to the parley.
Thank you very much, Representative O'Neill. We have 10 minutes of recess time built in, so finishing a little bit early isn't a big deal to me, which would technically discount as recess time. Some last minute notes for you all. For the judges, please do not leave this Zoom room until your ballot and your rankings are filled out. You must rank the top 8 competitors in this chamber, and also please make sure that the presiding officer has 2 total scores in this session. All right. The second thing I want to talk about is, each one of you know the drill. Your leadership bowl ballot should be, if you refresh in tab room, available for you to fill out. Please do not leave the chamber until that is filled out. If you want to just write in the chat like done, thank you, I'm fine with that. Just so like there's a visual record of like, hey, I did this, you know what I mean? Besides that, I think if I look at the schedule, you don't have pairings don't come out until 9, if I remember correctly. So there's a schedule for everyone to look at.
9 o'clock Central Time.
9 Central Time? Michelle?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
That is confirmed. All right. So if you all want to fill out your leadership ballots and we could absorb the rest of the time from finishing a bit early, I'm completely fine with that. It has been a pleasure to be your parliamentarian for this session. You all have made this really easy on me. No crazy motion games, no PO trying to speak. That makes my job really easy and really enjoyable to sit here and listen to you all engage in some really, really interesting debate. So give yourself a round of applause. Good luck for the rest of the tournament. If you don't clear, everyone have a great summer anyway. It's hot wherever we live, right? So thanks, y'all.
Thank you, judges. Have a great day.
The judges, you guys, this was my first NST Nets. It was pretty fun, even if I don't rank them.
Thank you so much for judging. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you, bye, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
I need sleep.
Judges, thank you so much for your time. Us competitors really appreciate it.
Sorry, I'm just finishing up my leadership thing.
Trust me, I'm slow at this stuff too. And one of the dogs is whining, so this actually works out very, very well.
All right, my ballot is in.
Awesome, thank you. Once it's done, get out of here.
Thanks.
Go enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. Have a good night.
You too.
Have a good night. All right, I should put done in the chat.
Mine will be submitted in just a minute.
You're good.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, y'all. Where am I at? Give me a second. Oh, where are you at? Of course, right when I finish, the dog's like, hey, let me out.
Yeah, just give me a couple of minutes.
There's no hurry. I'll sit in here. It's fine.